Welcome back to Outside Views, and you know that I like to be very frank, and it's absolute time that everybody gets it, and that's why this is the video where we finally have to talk about the truth of Brexit. Not the political fantasy of it, not the endless bickering over its implementation, but the cold, hard, undisputed reality of what leaving the European Union has done to the UK and their economy and its political system. And the truth is this: it was and is a disaster. It was a terrible mistake, and the fact that a major political party is only now finding the courage to say so speaks volumes about the level of political cowardice that has consumed the nation for years. The current government, which came into office promising a new era of competence, has finally changed its tone. We talked about this a few days ago. And this isn't a change in policy, not yet at least, but a fundamental shift in rhetoric, and it matters deeply. For too long, key government figures, including the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, spoke about the UK's detachment from Europe in the driest, most technocratic terms. It was treated as a feature of the natural landscape, like a mountain or a river. Awkward perhaps to navigate, but nobody's fault. And now they are finally prepared to call it what it is, an affliction. And we saw it last week at the International Monetary Fund meeting in Washington, and again at a regional investment conference. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is now listing Brexit right alongside the pandemic and austerity as a fundamental cause of the country's persistent economic lethargy. She said with clear, unambiguous language that the nation's productivity challenge has been compounded by the way in which the UK left the European Union. And the key word there is compounded. She's not saying the UK's problem started with Brexit, but that Brexit, and specifically the heartbreak that was chosen, took existing problems and made them exponentially worse. And this is a carefully crafted political formula, of course, because the political class still needs to manage the enormous baggage of the referendum. They are diagnosing harm not in the abstract idea of leaving, but in the manner of its implementation. They are blaming the politicians who did it, not the millions of ordinary people who voted for it. But for those of us who care about the evidence, that distinction is becoming increasingly irrelevant. The economic argument is settled. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the UK's own independent fiscal watchdog, calculates that the country's long-term productivity is going to be 4% lower than it would have been if it had retained EU membership. 4%. In an economy of that size, that 4% is not a theoretical number. It's a sustained perpetual tax on the entire population. It translates to billions in lost tax revenue every single year. Revenue that could be used for the struggling health service, yes, you know, the red bus, or for education or for infrastructure. And some estimates even suggest that up to £40 billion of the recent tax rises imposed by the government were needed simply to plug the revenue shortfall created by the lost growth from EU withdrawal. And this self-inflicted fiscal wound is what the Chancellor is struggling to manage as she prepares for the next budget. She wants people to know that when she raises taxes, Brexit is one of the reasons why. And alongside this crushing productivity hit, there are the tangible, measurable costs that have crippled businesses. There is the cost of new trade friction, the endless customs checks, the rules of origin paperwork, the regulatory divergence that has forced countless small and medium-sized firms to simply stop exporting to their largest and nearest market. There was the sustained hit to business investment caused by the years of relentless political tumult and gnawing regulatory uncertainty that followed the referendum. And then there is the massive, unforgivable opportunity cost. All of the government's energy for nearly a decade has been spent on a thankless, complex, and politically poisonous task for which absolutely no one was prepared. The people who thought leaving was a good idea had not seriously considered what might be involved in making it happen. The entire political and administrative apparatus of the state was consumed by a task of self-mutilation instead of being focused on the great challenges of the 21st century: climate change, technological change, and global competition. And even those who are supposed to be politically neutral are now struggling to affect that neutrality. I talked about this last week. Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, told the IMF gathering that he took no position per se on the political decision. But then he immediately gave his professional judgment that Brexit's impact on growth will be negative for the foreseeable future. And when the head of the central bank, a figure whose job is to speak with calm economic precision, is forced to admit that a major political decision has structurally damaged the economy for the foreseeable future, you know the game is up. The long-term economic model is broken, and no amount of optimistic talk about trade deals with countries thousands of miles away can undo the damage caused by building a thick, costly border with a massive market right on your doorstep. But here's the central tragedy. The political benefit of telling this truth is not guaranteed and may even be negative. The government is already neither new or popular, and when they expose the causes of the economic pain, it just sounds to most voters like they are making excuses for their own failure. The classic political defense, "we are clearing up the other lot's mess, don't let them begin," works only when your main opposition is the sole credible alternative. But the rise of Reform UK has completely complicated that picture. The new political reality is that the public is not just choosing between two moderate parties, they are seeing a fundamental split between the political establishment and the populist wing led by Mr. Brexit himself, Nigel Farage. And this is where the truth needs to be most sharply applied. The Labour government is trying to connect Farage to the Brexit lies on the side of that boss, the famous mis-selling that promised vast sums for the National Health Service. They are trying to paint him as a purveyor of snake oil, an exploiter of discontent who has no clue how to govern effectively. And they are right to do so. The rise of reform is fueled by people who have lost faith in the system, especially on issues like immigration control. They do not see the current government and the old opposition as sibling parties. They see one party with a proven recent record of not fixing the immigration problem, and another, Farage's party, promising to fix it radically. Farage himself is now understandably less eager to talk about Brexit, precisely because there is nothing positive to show for his role in it. The glorious liberation dream he sold has become the permanent damage the government is forced to talk about. If pressed, he can only offer the weak defense that the project was traduced by cowardice in the implementation, a defense that still places him in complicity with a massive disappointment. It's always simpler for him to change the subject and rail against the symptoms, the chaos, the immigration figures, rather than address the cause, which is the heartbreak he demanded. And this is why the government shift is so pivotal. They are finally dragging the issue back into the light, forcing a confrontation with the reality that Farage wants to avoid. And the Prime Minister's recent party conference speech was a turning point when he directly referenced the Brexit lies alongside the trauma of the pandemic. It was a stiffening of rhetorical posture, comparing the departure from the EU to a national affliction. This shift is the necessary first step, because you cannot begin to solve a problem until you finally name its true cause. The country is poorer, less competitive, and politically paralyzed because of a decision that was fundamentally flawed in its premise and disastrous in its execution. The tragedy is that the government is only finding the courage to speak the truth now when other excuses are spent, when the fiscal hole is so deep that they have nowhere left to hide. But for the sake of the country's future, for the sake of its economic recovery and its international standing, the truth, however painful, however politically inconvenient, must be told loudly and repeatedly until the political fiction is finally laid to rest. Brexit was a terrible mistake. And the sooner the entire political system confronts that fact, the sooner the country can begin the long, slow, and necessary work of rebuilding its relationship with its closest neighbors and restoring its economic rationality. And if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen.